name is Harold Petras. People who worked with me for 34 years called me Hal. My last direct supervisor, who had held the job for 11 months, called me a legacy asset. I have the email where he wrote that phrase. I have a lot of emails now. I want to start this at 2 in the morning in a server room in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. One rack is still blinking. The rest are dark. I am 62 years old. I have a brown spiral notebook in my left hand, and I am wearing the same fleece pullover I wore on my last official day of employment 4 months earlier. The security guard who walked me in does not know my name. He has been told to let me through because I am now, on paper, a contractor. A consulting arrangement, very specific, very narrow, negotiated on my terms. Across the street, a regional examiner from the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency is in a hotel room reviewing documents I mailed her in January. One of those documents is a scan of the page I am looking at right now. Trevor Arrives, the Chief Technology Officer, told 900 employees in the main auditorium of this bank that I was the past. 4 months later, that examiner asked me to explain, plainly and slowly, what was in this notebook. I took my time. Let me back up. Farmers and Merchants Heritage Bank is a regional institution headquartered in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Roughly $8 billion in assets, give or take a quarter depending on deposit cycles. About 900 employees across the corporate campus, and another 1,800 in branches across Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the western part of Illinois. The brick building where I worked is the original 1973 headquarters. Someone in the 90s glassed in the lobby, but the rest still feels like the year I graduated from Iowa State. Concrete ceilings, fluorescent tube lighting in the back corridors, a break room where the refrigerator hums at a pitch I have learned over the decades to tune out. I joined in the spring of 1991, my second job out of school. My first job was at a defense contractor in Ames that did work for the Department of Transportation, and I did not like the culture. So I moved to a bank. I did not set out to spend 34 years in one chair. It happened the way most long careers happen, by not leaving. My wife Ellen and I bought a house on the east side of Cedar Rapids in 1993. Our daughter Annika was born in 1995. Ellen died of ovarian cancer in 2018. Annika lives in Minneapolis now with her husband and 2 small boys, and I drive up to see them every other month. I mention these things because I want you to know I had a life outside this building. Some men do not. I did. But inside the building, my job for 34 years was to keep the core system running. I should explain what a core banking system is, because the phrase means something very specific to people inside banks and almost nothing to people outside them. When you open a checking account, take out a mortgage, get direct deposit, or deposit a check at the drive-thru on a Saturday, all of it passes through a piece of software called a core banking platform. The core calculates your balance. The core accrues interest. The core handles overnight settlement with the Federal Reserve. The core tracks dormant accounts under state unclaimed property law and turns them over to the state treasury when the clock runs out. The core is what makes a bank and not a spreadsheet. Our core was written in 1986, mostly in COBOL, which is older than I am, with a few custom Fortran modules for actuarial math on annuity products we no longer sell but still have customers holding from the 1980s. Over 34 years, the system has been patched and extended and taught how to behave around every edge case the state legislatures and federal regulators threw at it. Daylight savings, leap seconds, the year 2000, Fedwire cutoff windows, the 2011 change to Minnesota's dormancy rules. Every one of those was a conversation with the regulator, a patch, a test, a deployment, and an entry in a notebook. My notebooks. There are 34 of them. Each one is a brown spiral-bound cahier, 9 by 6 inches, from a company in Quincy, Illinois that sells office supplies to law firms and hospitals. I started using them because my first supervisor, a man named Garland Scholler, told me in 1991 that if you are going to work on regulated software, you will keep a written log of every change you touch, every reason you touched it, and every edge case you discovered while touching it. Garland said this was for 2 reasons. 1, for liability. because if a regulator ever asked why a specific interest calculation behaved a certain way, you would be able to answer. 2, because nobody in this business keeps code comments that actually help, so the only real documentation of a 30-year system is whatever the engineer wrote in his own hand and kept in his own drawer. Garland retired in 2004. I inherited the core, and I kept writing in the notebooks. By 2025, I had 34 of them lined up on a shelf, labeled by year. The 2009 notebook is a double because of the escheatment incident, which I will come back to. The 2020 notebook is a double because of the pandemic forbearance modifications. The rest are single volumes, about 400 pages each, roughly 3,000 handwritten edge cases over 3.5 decades. It is not a diary. It is an index of every reason the software behaves the way it behaves, cross-referenced against the regulation that caused it. When I say this notebook is the most valuable thing in the building, I mean literally. A regulator examining the bank cannot reconstruct its compliance history without it. Nobody in executive leadership understood that, until the examiner asked me to. Let me introduce Trevor. Trevor Malden joined Farmers and Merchants Heritage Bank as Chief Technology Officer in the spring of 2024. He was 33 at the time. Wharton MBA, class of 2016. Prior roles at a fintech consulting firm in Chicago, and a brief 18 months as Vice President of Platform Engineering at a digital-only lending startup that you have never heard of because it did not last long. His hiring was announced by the CEO, Dorothy Lindquist, as the beginning of a modernization initiative. Dorothy is 71, has run this bank for 22 years, and had been looking for someone to take the technology function off her plate. She was tired. I understood that. I had been tired for a while myself. I met Trevor on his third day. He came down to my office, which is on the second floor of the headquarters building, in a corner with a window that looks out on a service road and a row of maple trees. He introduced himself, shook my hand with a kind of practiced firmness, and asked me how long I had been with the bank. I said 33 years at that time. He said, and this is a direct quote because I wrote it down in the notebook that night. He said, "That is a remarkable monument to loyalty." He said it the way you would say a remarkable monument to something that has been dead for a while. He did not ask me what I did. He did not ask me to show him the system. He did not ask me if I had a handover plan. He told me that he was excited to bring the bank into, and I am quoting again, the cloud-native future. He said he was a big believer in sunsetting technical debt. He said he thought the next 18 months were going to be transformational. Then he said it was great to meet me, and he had another introduction to get to. He was in my office for about 7 minutes. I walked back to my desk and wrote 3 things in the notebook. I wrote, "New CTO, young, confident, treats 34 years of work as a museum piece." I wrote, "Did not ask what the system does." I wrote, "This is going to be a problem." Then I underlined the last line twice. I wish I had done more. I wish I had walked down to Dorothy's office right then and said, "You have hired a man who is going to try to replace the core in a year, and he does not know what the core is." I did not do that. I told myself Dorothy was smart. She would see it. The board would see it. The professionals would check themselves. I told myself the system was too important for anyone to touch recklessly. I told myself the adults in the room would act like adults. I was wrong about the adults. I am 62 years old, and I am still learning how often the adults in the room are waiting for someone else to be the adult. The first 4 months of Trevor's tenure looked from the outside like normal onboarding. He met every department head. He commissioned a third-party consulting firm, one of the Big Four, to do a technology landscape assessment. The assessment came back in August and recommended a full core replacement on an 18-month timeline with an offshore development partner based in Bangalore handling the migration work under Trevor's supervision. The executive summary used phrases like agility, competitive posture, legacy burden. It mentioned me twice, by title, as the current custodian of the existing system. It did not mention that I had 34 years of undocumented edge cases in notebooks on a shelf. I do not think Trevor told the consultants those notebooks existed. I am not sure he believed they existed in any meaningful sense. The board approved the migration plan in September. I was not invited to the board meeting. I learned about the decision when Trevor sent an all-hands email on a Thursday afternoon announcing, quote, "a bold step into the future of farmers and merchants." The email used the word bold 4 separate times. My name appeared once, in a thank you paragraph at the bottom, where Trevor wrote that he looked forward to partnering with Hal and the Legacy Systems team to ensure a smooth transition over the coming months. I read the email twice, walked to the break room, got a coffee, walked back, and added a line in the notebook. Bold is a word you use when you want to make failure sound like vision. The next week, I scheduled a one-on-one with Trevor to walk him through the architecture of the core system. I brought 7 notebooks, the ones covering the most consequential years, stacked on his conference table. He looked at them the way a man looks at a pile of sweaters at a yard sale. Politely, without interest. I said, "Trevor, before the migration starts, I need to walk you and the offshore team through these, because most of the decisions in this system were made in response to specific regulatory guidance that is not in any spec document. It is only in these books and in my head." He said, "Hal, I absolutely want to leverage your institutional knowledge, absolutely." He used that word, absolutely, 3 times in 2 minutes. He said we should schedule a series of knowledge transfer sessions with the offshore lead. He said he would have someone from his office reach out. He said, and again, I am quoting from the notebook, "We are going to build something so much cleaner than this." He gestured at the stack of notebooks when he said that, cleaner than those. The knowledge transfer sessions never happened. Someone from his office did reach out, twice, to schedule a meeting, and both times the meeting was canceled the morning of because the offshore lead had a conflict. After the second cancellation, I stopped trying to push for it. I assumed they would come back to me when they hit the first wall. They did not come back to me. Let me tell you about Priya. Priya Ramanathan is 27 years old. She joined the bank in June of 2023 as a junior systems administrator on the infrastructure team, 1 floor below me. She was a University of Illinois graduate, computer engineering, very sharp, very quiet, the kind of engineer who listens twice before she speaks once. She used to come up to my office in the afternoons to ask me questions about the core. Not the kind of questions a kid asks to make herself look smart, the kind of questions that told me she was actually trying to understand. I taught her how to read the operator console for the overnight batch jobs. I taught her which warnings you could ignore and which ones meant you had 30 minutes to stop production before something got ugly. I taught her where the notebooks were. I never let her take one home, but I let her sit at the desk and read. In October of 2024, a month after the board approved the migration plan, Priya sent a very polite email to Trevor and to the infrastructure director, asking 3 questions about the migration timeline. She asked whether the Bangalore team had signed the appropriate access agreements required under the bank's data governance policy. She asked whether the migration plan accounted for the state-specific dormancy cycles, which are not uniform across the 4 states we operate in. She asked whether the regulatory commitments made under 12 CFR Part 30 Appendix B, which governs operational risk management at banks of our size, had been reviewed against the new architecture. Those were the 3 questions. I saw the email. She copied me on it. I read the questions that evening, and I thought, this is a 27-year-old who has just identified the 3 most important regulatory failure points of the entire migration plan, and she asked them in writing, politely, with the word please, and copied her boss's boss. 2 weeks later, she was called into a meeting with her director and a human resources representative. She was told that the bank had decided her role was not a good cultural fit for the direction of the technology organization. She was offered 2 weeks of severance and a standard non-disparagement clause. She was asked to return her badge by end of day. Nobody contacted me. Nobody told me she had been walked out. I found out the next morning when I came up the stairs, and her chair was empty and her monitor was off. I went down to Trevor's office and asked him what had happened. He said Priya had, unfortunately, not been meeting the bar, and that sometimes a performance decision has to be made quickly. I said, Trevor, she sent 3 questions. he said. She sent 3 questions that demonstrated she did not trust the leadership of the initiative, and that is a cultural problem, not a technical question. I said, Trevor, the 3 questions were correct. He said, Hal, I appreciate your perspective, I really do, but this was a people decision and it has been made. He used the phrase, people decision. I wrote that down too. I went back to my office and sat in my chair for about an hour without doing anything. I looked out the window at the maple trees. I thought about Ellen, which I try not to do at work, and I thought about how the shape of a bad institution is that it will fire the person who is telling the truth before it fires the person who is being wrong on purpose. I thought about how I had not said anything to the board about the migration plan because I had been waiting for the adults in the room to do their jobs. I thought about how Priya had tried to be the adult and had been walked out for it. I thought about how I had 34 years of leverage in a drawer and I had been treating it like a quiet old man's hobby. Then I got up and went home at the regular time because I did not want anyone to see me leave early. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table in the house on the east side of Cedar Rapids with a yellow legal pad and a cup of coffee and started writing down what I actually knew. I should tell you about the 2009 patch because it is going to matter later. In March of 2009, I was at the office late because one of our vendors had pushed an update to the escheatment module, and I wanted to watch the first run with the new code in place. Escheatment is the legal process by which a bank turns over dormant account balances to the state treasury after a statutory period. Every state has its own unclaimed property law with its own rules about dormancy, interest accrual, fee deduction, and rounding. I ran the vendor module on a test set and noticed the ending balances for our Iowa dormant accounts were off by a few cents each, consistently in the same direction. I traced the rounding logic. The vendor had implemented banker's rounding, which is a legitimate accounting convention, but they had implemented it wrong for the sequence the Iowa statute required. Dormancy interest first, then fee deducted, then rounded to the nearest cent using commercial rounding. The vendor was rounding at the wrong step and in the wrong direction. 2 to 7 cents per account shaved off the state's final receipt. That is nothing on any one account. Across 3,100 dormant Iowa accounts that year, it was about $150 that should have gone to the state treasury and did not. If the bug stayed in production for 10 years, if it was also present for Minnesota and Wisconsin and Illinois, we would have a multi-state unclaimed property violation that would draw the attention of state attorneys general and possibly the Department of Justice. In 2007, a much larger bank had gotten in exactly that kind of trouble. I had read the consent order, so at 3 in the morning, I wrote a patch. Not to the main branch, to a maintenance branch, only I used, documented in the notebook as, the internal edge case correction branch, applied through the normal build pipeline so that production ran the corrected logic. I emailed the vendor with a detailed description and my correction. They acknowledged it and said they would take it under advisement. They never fixed it. Every subsequent vendor release I tested still had the bug. Every subsequent vendor release I deployed to production carried my correction forward. I documented all of it in the 2009 notebook, pages 44 through 81. Screenshots, original vendor source, my patch, the email thread, cross-references to each state's unclaimed property statute. I am telling you about this now because when Trevor's offshore team started their rewrite, they did not know the maintenance branch existed. They pulled the vendor's current source as the starting point for their own re-implementation. They were going to reintroduce a bug I had patched 16 years ago, and I was the only person in the building who knew. I went to bed that night in October of 2024 after Priya had been walked out, and I could not sleep. I kept thinking about the 2009 patch and about the 3 questions in Priya's email and about how Trevor was going to tell me to schedule the knowledge transfer sessions with the offshore team, and then those sessions were going to get canceled, and how the migration was going to happen anyway, and how the bug was going to come back and nobody would notice until the state treasuries started asking questions. The next morning, I came into work and started building the file. Let me describe the Digital Transformation Summit, because I think about it often. It was held in the main auditorium on a Thursday afternoon in early November of 2024. Between 800 and 900 people in the room. LED panels, theatrical lighting, 2 large screens flanking the podium, coffee and pastries in the lobby. Marketing had produced a 40-second hype video with motion graphics and a rising synth score that played before Trevor walked out. I remember thinking that at my old bank, before the 90s, they used to do quarterly updates in the break room with a whiteboard. Trevor walked out in a slim gray suit with no tie. He thanked Dorothy, the board, the consulting firm. He unveiled the migration roadmap. He made a joke about how Cloud Native was going to let them sleep through the overnight batch, and the audience laughed. Then he said he wanted to honor someone whose service had defined an era at Farmers and Merchants Heritage. He said my name. I was in the back row, between 2 people I did not know. To my left, a young man with a beard and a hoodie, a back-end developer on the digital banking team. To my right, a woman in her 30s, marketing. Neither of them knew who I was. When Trevor said my name, both of them turned and looked at me with mild surprise, as if a chair had spoken. Trevor asked me up. I walked the aisle, climbed the 3 steps. He put his arm around my shoulder and turned us toward the audience. He spoke for about 90 seconds about my 34 years of service, my loyalty, my dedication, my legacy mindset. He used that phrase, legacy mindset, the way you might describe your grandfather's woodworking hobby. Then, he produced from a side table a plastic sleeve containing a certificate and a gift card. The gift card was a bank-branded prepaid card loaded with $75. The certificate, in calligraphy font, recognized my decades of dedication. The sleeve was rigid, clear polypropylene with a crease down the middle. Trevor handed it to me. The audience applauded. Trevor said something about giving a big round for the man who built the house we were about to renovate. The audience applauded again, louder, in the performative way corporate audiences applaud when they are told to. I stood there for about 11 seconds. I did not say anything. I do not think the podium had a microphone for me in the first place. Then, Trevor moved on, and I walked off the side of the stage and back to my chair. The young man with the beard leaned over and whispered, "Nice, congratulations," like I had won an office raffle. I sat through the rest of the summit. Trevor described the migration plan in broad strokes, introduced the offshore lead by first name only over video from Bangalore, described the 18-month timeline as aggressive but achievable. He took 2 questions, both from senior executives who already knew the answers they wanted. The audience applauded a 3rd time. I put the plastic sleeve in my lap and waited for the room to clear. When the summit ended, I walked out through the side exit. I took the stairs down to the parking structure. I sat in my 2014 Chevrolet Impala and looked at the plastic sleeve on the passenger seat. The certificate said, Harold J. Petras, in calligraphy font. The gift card said $75 in small white letters on the bottom. The sleeve made a crinkling sound when I set it down. I drove home. Cedar Rapids is surrounded by cornfields. If you live on the east side of the city, like I do, you are 5 minutes from farmland in any direction that is not downtown. The afternoon had been overcast all day, and by the time I left the bank at around 4, the sun was lower, and the light was that flat, late autumn amber that comes through clouds in the Midwest. I did not drive home directly. I took Route 151 south and then cut east on a county road, which took me out along the Cedar River and through some farm country I had known for 30 years. I did not have a destination. I had the plastic sleeve in the passenger seat, and I was driving to be alone with it. About 15 miles out of the city, I pulled into the gravel lot of a closed-down gas station. It had been closed for years. The pumps were still there, rusted, a faded Conoco sign on a pole. There was a metal bench out front. I sat on the bench with the notebook. Not the plastic sleeve, the notebook, the brown one. I had been carrying a fresh one in my satchel since September. I opened the notebook to a clean page and wrote the date in the top corner, November 7th, 2024. And then I wrote, "They do not understand what they just did." Underneath that I wrote, "The plan will fail on Iowa escheatment by Tuesday of week 3. I underlined Tuesday. Then I sat on the bench for another 20 minutes, looking at the cornfields and thinking about Ellen, and thinking about Priya, and thinking about how I was going to spend the next several weeks assembling a document that would end Trevor Malden's career and probably my own permanent relationship with this bank. I do not want to romanticize that moment. I was tired and cold, and my hands hurt, and I was 62 years old in a gravel parking lot of a gas station that had been closed since 2016, holding a spiral notebook, and I was not sure at that moment whether I was going to go through with it or whether I was going to go home, eat a sandwich, and let the bank collapse on its own. I decided on the drive back that I was going to go through with it. I decided because Priya had asked 3 correct questions and been walked out for it, and because if I did not do something, the only record that those questions had ever been asked would be an email in a deactivated inbox. The next morning, I began building the file. I started with the regulatory framework because a document that is going to land on the desk of a federal bank examiner has to be organized around the exam. 12 CFR, Part 30, Appendix B, sets out operational risk management standards for banks of our size, with specific provisions on change management, third-party risk management, information security, and contingency planning. I built a 2-column spreadsheet. On the left, the provision. On the right, the specific element of Trevor's migration plan that violated it. No documented handover from the existing system owner to the offshore team. No data governance access agreements with the Bangalore vendor. No access control protocol for the cutover window. No documented rollback procedure in the event of a cutover failure, which is the single most important item in a regulatory rubric, and which Trevor's plan did not address at all. That was the spine of the document. Then, I went back through my notebooks and pulled out every edge case in the core system that was going to fail under the new architecture as Trevor had described it. There were 211 of them. Some were small. Some would produce a complaint to the bank from a retail customer and could be fixed in a few days by a competent team. Some were medium. Some would produce a phone call from a state regulator within a week of the cutover, and 23 of them were, in my professional judgment, based on 34 years of doing this work, catastrophic, meaning they would produce a federal-level compliance event or a direct loss of customer funds measurable in millions of dollars. At the top of the catastrophic list was the 2009 patch. The Iowa achievement rounding bug, still present in the vendor source that the offshore team was using as their starting point, that I had patched in my own maintenance branch 16 years earlier, and that no one else in the organization knew about. I want to pause here to say something plain. I did not sit down that evening gleeful or even grim about the fact that the migration was going to fail. I sat down exhausted and sad. I had spent 34 years keeping this system running, and the reason I was documenting how it was going to break was because somebody had decided that my work was a monument, and that monuments are what you put in glass cases on the lobby wall. I was not writing a revenge document. I was writing an obituary in the technical tense. Here is what this system has done. Here is what it is about to stop doing. Here is what the cost will be. And here is the name of the person who was told, in writing, on plain paper, that these were the risks. I was writing a record so that when the migration collapsed, there would be no room for anyone to say, "We did not know." While I was building the file, I reached out to Priya. I waited a week after the summit before I contacted her because I wanted to be certain I was not using her as a prop for my own anger. I called her from a payphone outside a grocery store on the east side, which may sound paranoid, but I wanted to make sure our first conversation was not on a bank phone or a bank email. I left a message on her cell. I said, "Priya, it is Hal Petras. I am not calling from work. I would like to talk to you in person when you have a free evening, and I have a specific reason that I will explain when we meet." She called me back the same night from her own cell. She said, "Hal, I was hoping you would call me." We met on a Saturday morning at a coffee shop downtown called New Bohemia Coffee in a neighborhood that used to be Czech. Priya had brought a manila envelope. Inside the envelope were printouts of every email she had sent regarding the migration plan, including the original 3-question email, along with the replies she had received, the meeting notes she had taken during the October review sessions, and screenshots of Slack messages between Trevor and the offshore lead in which Trevor referred to, quote, the COBOL grandpas, end quote, and in which he made a joke about, quote, paying a small tax in productivity to manage around Hal for a few more weeks, end quote. She had also preserved access logs showing that her termination had been processed by Trevor's office, not by her direct supervisor, which was a minor violation of the bank's own human resources procedures. I looked through the envelope. I asked her if she was okay. I asked her what she needed. I asked her if she wanted to be named in the document I was building or whether she wanted to be a confidential source. She thought about it for a long time. She said she wanted to be named. She said, Hal, if we are going to put this in front of a federal examiner, I do not want to be a whisper. I want to be on the page. I said, okay. I said, Priya, you understand that this is going to make it harder for you to get hired in banking if it goes the wrong way. She said, Hal, I have already been fired in banking. It cannot get much worse. She was right, and she was 27 years old, and she was sitting across a coffee shop table from me, telling me she wanted her name on a regulatory complaint. And I thought, this is the kind of person who is going to be running things in 15 years, and if we do nothing, she will have been chased out of the industry before she got the chance. I took the envelope home that afternoon and added her documentation to the file. Then Marvin found me. Marvin Eckhart is the senior internal auditor at the bank, and his office is on the 3rd floor across from the compliance group. He is 58, has been at the bank for 19 years, and had been a forensic accountant at a Big Four firm before that. I had known Marvin in a distant professional way for most of my tenure. He audited my area every other year as part of the standard internal audit rotation, and our interactions had always been cordial and professional and bounded by the specific questions on his audit checklist. We had never had what you would call a friendship. I did not know whether he had children or what his weekends looked like. I knew he liked black coffee and did not like surprises. About 10 days after my conversation with Priya, Marvin came to my office unannounced at 4 in the afternoon. He closed the door behind him. He sat down in the guest chair. He said, Hal, I think we have a problem with the migration, and I think you know about it. He said it flatly, not as a question. I looked at him and I said, Marvin, what do you know? And he said, I know that the offshore vendor was selected through a procurement process that did not go through the standard third-party risk management review, that the signed vendor agreement was backdated by 11 days to avoid a quarterly reporting threshold, and that the CTO's office signed off on the procurement in a way that violates our own vendor management policy. I asked him if he had documentation. He said he had a folder. I asked him if he had shared the folder with anyone. He said he had shared it with no one because he did not trust the chain of escalation. The chain of escalation went through the CTO's office. I said, Marvin, I am putting together a file for the OCC. I said, I am putting it together because I do not trust the chain of escalation either, and because Priya Ramanathan, who was fired for asking the right questions, is willing to be named as a source. I said, would you like your documentation to be part of the file? Marvin sat in the guest chair for a long moment. He looked out my window at the maple trees. He said, Hal, I have wanted to send something like this to the OCC for 6 months. I have not done it because I have a daughter in her 2nd year of college, and I cannot lose my job right now. If I give you this folder, I need your commitment that I will be a confidential source until the examination is formally opened. At that point, I am willing to testify. Until that point, I cannot be on the page. I said, okay. I said, Marvin, that is fair, and that is exactly how I would do it if I were in your seat. I said, the file is going out in January. I said, if I get a call from the examiner, I will be careful about your name. I said, and thank you. He handed me the folder the next day. I want to describe the folder because it was a work of quiet professional excellence. It was a standard black binder with tabs. The tabs were labeled Procurement, Vendor Agreement, Governance Sign-Offs, Quarterly Reporting Anomalies, and Emails. Inside each tab, the documents were in reverse chronological order, with a cover page summarizing what each document showed. The cover pages were typed, single-spaced, in a sans serif font that Marvin must have used for his audit reports for 19 years. At the back of the binder, Marvin had tucked a single handwritten page listing his own questions and suspicions about the procurement, each question numbered, each one ending in a question mark. None of them answered. I read the handwritten page 3 times. It was the only evidence in the whole binder of what Marvin felt. Everything else was facts. I added Marvin's binder to the file. The file was now a thick accordion folder on my kitchen table with 4 sections. Section 1 was my notebooks, indexed by year and cross-referenced to the regulatory framework. Section 2 was the 211 technical edge cases, with the 23 catastrophic ones flagged and the 2009 patch as the lead item. Section 3 was Priya's envelope, with her original 3 questions, the replies, the meeting notes, the Slack screenshots, and her signed statement that she was willing to be named. Section 4 was Marvin's binder, under confidentiality until the examination was opened. The accordion folder was held together by a thick rubber band from a bunch of asparagus I had bought the week before. It sat on my kitchen table for 2 weeks while I wrote the cover letter. The cover letter was 7 pages, single-spaced, on plain white paper. No letterhead. I addressed it to the Deputy Comptroller for Midsize and Community Bank Supervision with a copy to the Kansas City Regional Field Office. I wrote it the way I would write an incident report. Purpose, position, and tenure. Specific regulatory provisions violated, with citation. Factual basis for each violation, in chronological order, referencing the attached documents. My concerns about the Iowa escheatment issue and the projected impact if migration proceeded. Priya's name and contact information. Mine. A closing sentence stating I was available. I printed the letter in 3 copies, 1 for Washington, 1 for Kansas City, 1 for myself. I printed the accordion folder contents in duplicate. I drove to the main post office in downtown Cedar Rapids on a Tuesday in early January and mailed both envelopes by certified mail with return receipt. Then I went home and waited. Waiting was the hardest part. I had spent 6 weeks building the file, and I had been busy and focused the whole time. And the morning after I mailed the envelopes, I came into the office and had nothing to do except my normal work, which had been steadily hollowed out by Trevor's reorganization anyway. I answered emails. I reviewed a handful of routine change tickets on the core system. I sat in a meeting where the offshore lead, on video from Bangalore, presented the week's progress on the rewrite. He did not mention any of the regulatory framework I had outlined in my file. He did not mention the edge cases. He did not mention the 2009 patch because he did not know about it. I sat at the back of the conference room with a polite expression on my face and counted how many times he said the word seamless. He said it 11 times in 30 minutes. 2 weeks after I mailed the envelopes, I received a phone call on my personal cell at 7 in the evening. A senior examiner in the Kansas City Regional Field Office of the OCC. She said she had read the cover letter twice. She wanted an in-person meeting. I said Cedar Rapids would be easier because I did not want to explain a day off to the bank. We agreed on a conference room in the Federal Building downtown. We met on a Wednesday morning in late January. She was in her mid-40s, navy suit, very composed. The file was open on the table in front of her, tabbed and annotated with small yellow sticky notes. She asked me to walk her through the notebooks. I did. She asked me to explain the 2009 patch in detail. I did. She asked me to describe the procurement process for the offshore vendor. I did, carefully, attributing the details to publicly available bank documents and not to Marvin. She took notes in a small leather-bound notebook of her own, which made me smile, and which made her smile back for about half a second before her professional face returned. At the end of the meeting, which lasted about 3.5 hours, she closed her notebook and said, "Mr. Petras, I am going to recommend that we open an examination. I am going to recommend we act quickly. This is not a commitment on behalf of the agency, but it is a commitment on behalf of me personally in this field office." Then she said something I have thought about often since. The hardest thing about this job is that most of our information comes from people who are taking a personal risk to give it to us, and most of them do not know whether they are doing the right thing. You do. Thank you for the letter. I drove home through the cold. I did not call Priya. I did not call Marvin. I did not open the notebook. I just drove. 2 weeks after the meeting in Cedar Rapids, the OCC notified Farmers and Merchants Heritage Bank in writing that a formal examination was being opened specifically on the topics of change management, third-party risk management, and the ongoing core system migration. The letter went to Dorothy, with copies to the Board Audit Committee and to Trevor. I was copied on the internal distribution of the letter because my name was still in the system as the senior engineer on the core. When I saw the letter in my inbox that morning, I closed my office door and looked out the window at the maple trees for a long time. Trevor called me at 11. He said, "Hal, did you see the letter?" I said, "Yes, Trevor." He said, "We need to get ahead of this." I said, "Trevor, I do not think you understand what this letter is." He said, "It is a routine examination with an unfortunate scope, and I need your help framing our response." I said, "Trevor, a formal examination under these terms is not routine." He said, "Hal, I need all hands on deck." He used that phrase, all hands on deck. I said, "Trevor, I have been on deck for 34 years. I just have not been in the room where the ship was being steered." He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "Hal, I need you in the room for the examiner's visit." I said, "Trevor, the examiner is aware of my existence." I hung up. I was not rude, but I was firm. The migration cutover was scheduled for the first weekend of March. The OCC examination was still in its early document collection phase, and the bank, through Trevor and the consulting firm, made the decision to proceed with the cutover on the original timeline, despite the open examination. I was not in the cutover room. I was not invited. I was sitting at home that Saturday morning with a cup of coffee and a yellow legal pad, and I was tracking the cutover by listening for the sound of my personal phone ringing. The first call came at 11 in the morning on Saturday. It was from Marvin. He said, "Hal, the cutover is in progress. The core system is up on the new architecture, but the overnight batch has not reconciled correctly. There is a discrepancy in the state dormant account totals. They are calling me in." I said, "Marvin, do not lie. Do not volunteer. Answer only what they ask." He said, "I know." He hung up. The second call came at 4 in the afternoon. It was from Priya, who was not employed by the bank, but had heard through her own network that something was wrong. She said, "Hal, they are asking questions in public Slack channels. The cutover is not going well." She was audibly trying not to sound excited. I said, "Priya, remember that whatever we feel today, real people are going to be affected by this." She said, "I know, Hal, I know." She said she was going to go for a run. The third call came at 8 in the evening from a number I did not recognize. It was Dorothy, the CEO. I had not spoken to Dorothy in person in probably 3 years. She said, "Hal, this is Dorothy Lindquist." I said, "Yes, Dorothy." She said, "Hal, I am calling you from home on my personal phone, and this is not an official communication." I said, "I understand." She said, "Is it true that you sent a letter to the OCC in January?" I said, "Yes, Dorothy, it is true." She said, "Hal, why did you not come to me?" I said, "Dorothy, I considered coming to you. I considered it for a long time. But the last time I tried to escalate a technical concern through the CTO's office, the junior engineer who raised it was fired within 2 weeks. I did not trust the internal chain anymore. I wrote to the regulator because the regulator is the chain that is supposed to exist for situations like this." Dorothy was quiet for several seconds. Then she said, "Hal, I should have seen this coming." I said, "Dorothy, you should have." She said, "Are you willing to meet with me and the board next week?" I said, "Yes, I am willing." She said, "Thank you, Hal." She said, "One more thing." She said, "I am sorry." Then she hung up. By Sunday afternoon, the cutover had produced the first wave of measurable consequences. The Iowa dormant account reconciliation was off by approximately $340,000 in a single batch, exactly in the direction and magnitude that the escheatment rounding bug would produce on the first weekend of the month. The Minnesota overnight interest posting had miscalculated hardship exceptions because the offshore team's reimplementation did not honor the state-specific exemption rules. 6 Wisconsin commercial accounts had incorrect overdraft fee calculations. 2 Illinois trust accounts had their automatic distributions held up because the sweep logic had not been ported correctly. None of these were customer-facing disasters yet, but the internal dashboards were red, and the operations center was paging engineers in Bangalore who were trying to trace the failures without access to the original system architecture because they had not been given the handover. On Monday morning, Dorothy convened an emergency meeting of the board audit committee. I was invited. I attended. I brought a single page of notes. I explained the Iowa escheatment issue in plain language. I explained the 4-state misalignment. I explained the concept of the 2009 patch in 2 sentences. I did not mention the OCC file. I did not need to, because the board audit committee had been briefed on the opened examination the previous week. I watched the board chairman, a retired businessman named Rylan Booth, who had been on the board longer than Trevor had been alive, take notes in a leather-bound notebook with a tortoiseshell pen. At the end of my explanation, Rylan put down the pen and said, "Harold, I want to ask you one question. Could this have been prevented if the knowledge transfer sessions had been held as originally planned?" I said, "Ryland, yes, it could have." He nodded once and said, "Thank you." 2 days later, the bank announced that the migration was being halted. The press release described the halt as a prudent pause to allow for, quote, "additional risk verification," end quote, in response to the ongoing regulatory review. On the same day, Trevor Malden announced his resignation, effective immediately, to pursue, quote, "new opportunities in financial technology." Dorothy sent a bank-wide email thanking Trevor for his service and announcing that an interim technology lead had been appointed from within the existing staff. The interim lead was an engineer from the infrastructure team who had been on good terms with Priya before her dismissal. Within a week, Priya was offered her job back. She accepted. She negotiated for a title change and a modest raise on the way back in. She also negotiated for a formal letter of apology from the bank to be kept in her personnel file. She did not show me the apology letter, and I did not ask to see it. That was between her and the institution. Within 2 weeks, Marvin Eckhart gave a confidential deposition to the OCC examiner. His name came out of the shadows at that point. The procurement documentation he had assembled became the backbone of the OCC's third-party risk management findings. Marvin was not fired. He was not promoted either. He kept his job, and he kept his daughter in college, and he told me the night after the deposition, over the phone, that he had been able to sleep for the first time in a year. Within a month, the OCC issued a matter requiring attention letter to Farmers and Merchants Heritage Bank. The letter detailed violations of 12 CFR Part 30 Appendix B across change management, third-party risk management, and contingency planning. The letter did not impose a monetary penalty, but it required the bank to submit a remediation plan under OCC supervision, which, in practice, meant that any future technology initiative of meaningful size was going to be reviewed by the examiner's office before it started. The letter also referred the Iowa escheatment issue to the Iowa Division of Banking and to the Iowa Attorney General's Unclaimed Property Unit for separate handling. The AG's office determined after review that the aggregate exposure across the 4 states, over the lifetime of the bug if it had stayed in production uncorrected, would have been approximately $3.1 million in underpaid escheatment over 10 years. The bank voluntarily paid that amount, plus interest, into the combined state treasuries as a matter of good faith. The board, meeting again 2 weeks after the MRA letter was received, asked me to return to the bank as the permanent head of core systems, reporting directly to Dorothy, with a significant increase in pay and the authority to build a proper multi-year migration plan under regulatory oversight. I thanked them for the offer. I declined. I declined for 2 reasons. The first reason is that I am 62 years old, and I have been sitting in the same chair for 34 years, and I have learned that the job of being the senior engineer on a legacy core system is a job that destroys your capacity to be surprised by anything, and I wanted to see if I could still be surprised by things. The second reason is harder to say plainly. I declined because I had learned something about the bank during the previous 6 months that I could not unlearn. I had learned that the adults in the room would wait for someone else to be the adult. I had learned that when Priya Ramanathan asked 3 correct questions, the institution's first instinct was to walk her out. I had learned that the only reason any of this had worked out was that I, alone, at 62, had decided to use the leverage that had been sitting in a drawer for 34 years. That is not the kind of story you want to have to repeat. I did not want to come back into the room and find myself 12 months from now holding a different notebook about a different problem and waiting again for the adults to find their courage. So I offered a consulting arrangement instead. I would advise the new core systems team on regulatory-facing technical decisions for an agreed daily rate, on my own schedule, from my own kitchen table, reporting to a committee of 3 with a narrow scope of authority and a clear end date 18 months out. Dorothy accepted. The board accepted. We signed the agreement in late March, and I began working under it in April. Which brings us back to the server room at 2 in the morning. I drove down to the bank that night because the new team had flagged a question about how the Iowa overnight batch behaved during the first daylight savings transition under the halted migration rollback procedure. It was a question that could only be answered by someone who had watched the system run through daylight savings transitions under a variety of patch states, which, in the entire world, was me. It could have waited until morning, but I had been up anyway, thinking about Ellen, and I had put on the fleece pullover because driving down to the bank at 2 in the morning to answer a technical question felt like a thing I still knew how to do. I signed in under my contractor badge. I walked to the server room. One rack was still active on the partial rollback, green LEDs blinking in the slow pulse I had been watching for 34 years. The rest of the racks had been powered down for the migration prep, dark mirrors in the rows around me. I opened the notebook to the 2009 double volume, section on daylight savings interaction with dormancy interest accrual, page 63. My own handwriting from March 2010, cross-referenced to the patch branch. The answer was there. I stood in the server room for another minute. I thought about the plastic sleeve and the $75 gift card still in the passenger seat pocket of my Impala, unused. I thought about Trevor Maldon, who had resigned and taken a vice president role at a fintech company in Denver because a man with his resume always lands somewhere. I thought about Priya, at her desk 1 floor above me, doing the work of 2 people. I thought about Marvin, who had finally started sleeping. I thought about the examiner, whose first name I still did not know, who had told me most of her information came from people who did not know whether they were doing the right thing. I walked out. Small city parking lots at 2 in the morning in early spring are quiet the way you can hear your own coat move. I drove home to the house on the east side with the crabapple tree Ellen had planted in 1995. I made a cup of tea. I sat at the kitchen table with the notebook. On my yellow legal pad, I had written, months earlier, "Keep the file current." I turned the pad over. I drank the tea. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel tragic. I felt like a man who had closed a long book on the correct page. Here is what I want you to take from this story. Garland Schuller told me in 1991 that if you work on regulated software, you keep a written log. I believed him, and the log turned out to be the most important thing I ever built. More important than any line of code. It was a record of the reasons. The reasons for the patch, the reasons for the workaround, the reasons for the exception the regulator approved in 2011 that nobody else in the building remembered. The reasons are the job. The job is not the code. Trevor Maldon was not evil. He was efficient. He was trying to put a cloud-native migration on his resume in 9 months, and he treated 34 years of institutional knowledge as an obstacle because nobody had ever told him the knowledge was the institution. The consulting firm sold him a deck with the word agility on it. The board bought Trevor. Everyone applauded. The only person who knew what was in the box was a 62-year-old engineer with a brown spiral notebook, waiting for someone to ask. They did not ask. They handed me a $75 gift card in a plastic sleeve. What I did was not brave. I was 62. My wife was gone. My mortgage was paid off. I had less to lose than almost anyone in that building. Priya was 27 and willing to be named on the first page. Marvin had a daughter in college and still handed me the folder. They took the risks. I did the paperwork. The real story is a sequence of small decisions made by ordinary people who chose, at small personal cost, not to let a bad thing happen quietly. Priya sending the email. Marvin assembling the folder in reverse chronological order. Dorothy calling me from home on a Sunday night. The examiner saying most of her information came from people taking a personal risk. A security guard letting me into a server room at 2 in the morning because the paperwork said he should. Those are the decisions that keep institutions honest, not the speeches in the main auditorium. In one quarter, I ended my career twice. Once when they pushed me out. Once when they asked me back and I said no. Both endings were correct. I still drive out to the closed gas station sometimes. The light comes through the clouds at a flat amber angle in late autumn in Iowa. I think about Ellen. I think about Trevor once in a while, and I wish him well, because the notebook in my hand was the thing he was throwing away, and I hope someone at the next place tells him what the work is. My name is Harold Petras. I am 62 years old. I worked for 34 years at a bank in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I kept a written record of the reasons. When the bank forgot what the reasons were, the record was still there. That is the whole story. That is all it ever was. Thank you for listening.